Good day, everybody. Welcome back to our Genesis class, live from Jerusalem. This is Rabbi Chaim Goldberg's class, but unfortunately, he got called away to a meeting today he couldn't get out of, and that's okay. He's made provisions, and we're so honored to have with us today Rabbi Shmuel Herschler, who's been sitting in with us lately. I find he's quite a Talmud Chacham, and it's just a joy to have such a learned scholar share Torah tradition as it was intended with us. So let's just tune right in and see how the rabbi's doing today. Shalom, Rabbi Herschler. So good to be with you, sir. Thank you so much for continuing this class.
Shalom, it's my absolute pleasure. Whenever it works out, it's with an absolute pleasure and joy, and I was happy that I was able to stand in for Rabbi Goldberg. I want to tell you, since it's a Genesis class on the one hand, and we are utterly now less than 10 days away from Passover, I'd actually like to show an interesting link, which I don't think you have done, between Genesis itself and Passover. And why is that rather surprising? I'll tell you why. Because all of you obviously are aware of the fact that the story related to Passover relates to the release from servitude in Egypt, which actually is in Exodus. That's where the servitude begins, and the main story of the plagues and the Exodus basically are between chapters 8 and 12 of Exodus itself, and chapter 14 and early 15, the splitting of the Red Sea, which traditionally was on the seventh day of Passover. But ironically enough, already in Genesis, there are hints to Passover in interesting ways, despite the fact that we were not yet a full nation, and yet the idea does come up in a number of ways. And I would like, with your permission, to try to share some of that with you this evening. Some of the stuff is a little bit part of philosophy and thought, but I think you may find it interesting. If you have in front of you Genesis 27, there you will find the story of Isaac trying to bless his older son Esau. If you can put it on screen, fine. If not, I will manage. But if you have it there, Dad, it might be nice if it can be shown. I start already from the beginning, the first part. You can read it straight in English, and I will focus on some of the main issues.
All right, Genesis chapter 27. It came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were too dim to see, that he called Esau his elder son, and he said to him, My son. And he said to him, Here I am. And he said, Behold, now I have grown old. I do not know the day of my death. So now sharpen your implements, your sword, and take your bow, and go forth to the field and hunt game for me, and make for me tasty foods as I like, and bring them to me, and I will eat, in order that my soul will bless you before I die. But Rebekah overheard when Isaac spoke to Esau his son, and Esau went into the field to hunt game to bring it. And Rebekah said to Jacob her son, Behold, I have heard your father speaking to Esau your brother, saying, Bring me game and make me tasty foods, and I will eat, and I will bless you before the Lord before my death. And now, my son, hearken to my voice, to what I am commanding you. Go now to the flock, and take for me from there 2 choice kids, and I will make them tasty foods for your father as he likes. And you shall bring them to your father, that he may eat, in order that he bless you before his death. And Jacob said to...
Let's halt for 1 second there, if you don't mind. I'll make sometimes a pause just to make sure you can clarify. And welcome for all those who have joined in. The meantime, hopefully more will join even later. Basically, Isaac and Rebekah have 2 sons, and Esau slightly older than Jacob. That already is found in Genesis 25. Difference in age, maybe a few minutes. They're the first twin actually mentioned in the Bible together. But Esau is slightly older, and anybody who thinks that Isaac did not have an idea about rearing children or what his kids were like, he was quite aware that in order to actually offer Esau a blessing, he would actually have to suggest for him to do something which would be positive act, namely to respect his father. And since being an animal hunter, if not beyond, he said, bring me game, and this way I will go ahead and bless you. Now, what is traditionally found is in Genesis 25. If you want to shoot back for a minute, 2 chapters back, look around verse 20 in Genesis 25, read a few verses there, and you'll see what Rebekah is undergoing. That's
Around verse 20, it says, And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to write to himself for a wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord opposite his wife because she was barren, and the Lord accepted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled within her, verse 22, and she said, If it be so, why am I like this? And she went to inquire of the Lord. Verse 23, And the Lord said to her, Two nations are in your womb, and two kingdoms will separate from your innards, and one kingdom will become mightier than the other, and the elder will serve the younger.
okay.
24.
So you see already there that Rebekah has been told by the Lord that her twins have different features and that the senior child will be actually subordinate to the younger child. It is not mentioned anywhere between chapter 25 and 27 that this divine message that that Rebekah had received, that she conveyed the message to her husband. It's not mentioned anywhere. And it seems like that this was a secret given to her. And she was aware that there's not going to be a real peace between these two sons of hers. That's also part of the reason why she's saying it's not only the labor of having twins. I know of other people who've had twins. It's not necessarily easy, but it's not something which is unnatural. But here, as you beautifully read, you can see already that there is a struggle that is about to occur between these two nations. And she is already aware that the younger one is going to basically be the leader between the two. If you want to continue on reading a little bit more in Genesis 25, from the chapter that you are, you will see how the difference between Isaac and Rebekah have between those two children. Go ahead.
24, and her days to give birth were completed, and behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first one emerged ruddy. He was completely like a coat of hair, and they named him Esau. And afterwards his brother emerged, and his hand was grasping Esau's heel, and he named him Jacob. Now Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. 27, and the youths grew up, and Esau was a man who understood hunting, a man of the field, whereas Jacob was an innocent man dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because his game was in his mouth, but Rebekah loved Jacob.
Okay, now, so here we see two things which are quite interesting. First of all, that they are definitely very different in nature. And what could be already challenging, if not beyond, is that the rearing by the parents seemed to actually include a struggle between them, who to prefer between the two children. Now, it's not as if Rebekah disliked Esau, and it's certainly not to be said that Isaac disliked Jacob. But it could very well be, and this is something which I don't know if you experienced in your parenthood, but sometimes each child is different, and sometimes the challenge you get from a certain child who may be a little bit less disciplined than the other, or the others, you can be very surprised in the positive side if you find a way towards that child. In my own family, I have 4 kids, and my fourth one was a boy. The first 3 are girls. He was a little bit, let's say, less disciplined in certain senses of the word, and we had to find our way with him. And his crime today is he's in medical school, so you never know. and a good student there too. And he was a submarine fighter in the military. So not somebody who was uneducated or unsuccessful. You just have to find the clue, what is unique about these children who are a bit nonconformist, and you find a way to handle. Now, but what Rebecca does understand is that there's not going to be an easy time between the two brothers themselves. And each one of the parents focused to a certain extent on the upbringing of one compared to the other. And she had also a divine Lord message, as you read, that Jacob is going to be more successful or more take the lead. And the question which is at stake is, would it be reasonable that Isaac will give his entire blessing to Esau? And this could be quite strongly at the expense of Jacob, something that Rebecca is concerned of. But honestly, we have a real dilemma, because what she's actually saying, what you read in chapter 27 so nicely, is that she's basically telling Jacob to bypass what her husband had in mind. She wants him to intercept the blessing that Isaac had designated for Esau. And this in itself is something which is not very simple, because on the one hand, she did get a message in that spirit, but is it reasonable to receive a blessing in a way which Isaac was unaware of at the time? This is something which needs a little bit of understanding. But I know I'm causing a little bit of work today. Can you kindly read from the beginning of chapter 19, moving back in the Bible? All this is Genesis, by the way. Chapter 19. The angels get to Lot's house. Then I'll tie it all together.
Do you want me to start from the top?
Yeah, it's not much, about 7-8 verses of chapter 19 in the beginning.
All right, chapter 19. And the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom, and Lot saw and arose toward them, and he prostrated himself on his face to the ground. And he said, Behold now, my lords, please turn to your servant's house, and stay overnight, and wash your feet, and you shall arise early and go on your way. And they said, No, but we will stay overnight in the street. And he urged them strongly, and they turned into him and came into his house. And he made them a feast, and he baked unleavened cakes, and they ate. When they had not yet retired, and the people of the city, the people of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, the entire populace from every end of the city. And they called...
We can cut there for a minute. So already mentions the unleavened bread here that Lot had baked for his guests. It also mentioned in the first verse that you quoted that the angels arrived in Sodom in the evening. Where were they during the daytime? I'm not going to tire you, but in the previous chapter, in chapter 18, the angels originally came to Abraham, and they promised Sarah that within a year she's going to have a baby. Now, Sarah was barren for many years, and she was promised to have her own baby. Abraham already had a son through Hagar, Ishmael, but Sarah was still barren at that time, and she was no spring chicken. She was 89, and Abraham was 99. And a year later, and that's found in Genesis 21, that Abraham had his son Isaac when he was 100, and Sarah was 90. It's mentioned there directly in the text. In any event, our rabbis add here, and I admit it's not directly in the text, but it certainly fits in well to the context. The same day in which Abraham and Sarah were visited by the angels, two angels that evening came to Sodom. Now, I don't know where some of you live. Some of you live in various parts of the world. But in Israel, the distance between Elonei Mamre, the plains of Mamre, which is near Hebron, and Sodom is about a drive of about an hour and a quarter. And it's reasonable to get that type of distance within the same day and to come in the evening. What's fascinating, though, is that Lot baked unleavened bread. For what? There was no yet exodus from Egypt. There was no yet commandment in any way of eating unleavened bread at a given time. And Lot is baking, of all things, this unleavened bread, and it's mentioned. Now, if you want to explain it very simplistically, the answer is simple. You know, some of you I know are wonderful hostesses. People come to your house and they come and they don't have much time, or your husband is a little bit impatient. You just got back from work and he wants to do something. So it's a very quick meal. This I can tell you, it's much easier to prepare unleavened bread than to prepare proper bread until it rises and goes far. And according to the tradition, incidentally, part of the reason why we eat on Passover the unleavened bread is that we were deported or expelled from Egypt by Pharaoh, and we couldn't linger and stay any longer. So therefore, they had to eat something that takes a short time to prepare. So it could theoretically be that the angels are saying that we're not going to stay, we're going to sleep in the street, that in order to get something quick to eat, so he prepared unleavened bread. But the medieval Jewish commentator Rashi, which I'm sure you heard of, Shlomo Yitzchaki, who lived between 1040 and 1105, he says this event happened on Passover, which means that Isaac was born a year after this episode because his mother was promised a year later exactly that she would have a baby. He was born on Passover. Now, getting back to where we started in Genesis 27, and I'm not trying to confuse you at all. There's a fascinating thing that comes out. Isaac wants to bless his son Esau before he is about to pass away. Although there's plenty of time, but that's what he's saying. He is about to bless his son on his birthday. This whole event in Genesis 27 is something that Isaac is actually doing now to bless him on Passover itself. Now, there's an interesting hint to this matter. You read about the two kids that Rebecca told Isaac to go and bring from the field, and I will make sweets and a very tasty meal for your father. This is what she said in explaining why she asks him to go ahead and bring this. But if you go back for a minute to that verse in chapter 27, I want to show you something interesting about it. It's in verse 9. Go out to the sheep and bring me from there 2 kids, and I will make them tasty for your father. If you were to know a little bit of Hebrew, there's an interesting phenomenon in verse 9. It says there, go out to the sheep, v'kach li misham. Take for me. Now, is she allowed to go ahead and take food which doesn't belong to her? No, she's not doing that. She's saying to him, please bring me from what I actually own. I wanted 2 kids today, 2 kids as animals for your father to eat. By Jewish tradition, on Passover, we actually have 2 kids that were brought when the temple was around, one for the Paschal lamb, another for the celebration of that evening. Furthermore, if you look a little bit further down, you will see when he actually comes, Jacob, to his father, he doesn't just bring him meat, but he does bring him that as well. Can you read verses 19 through 24? Is that okay, of chapter 27?
No problem, Rabbi. 19, and Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you have spoken to me. Please rise, sit down, and eat of my game, so that your soul will bless me. 20, and Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? And he said, because the Lord your God prepared it before me. 21, and Isaac said to Jacob, please come closer so that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not. So Jacob drew near to Isaac his father, and he felt him, and he said, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. 23, and he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like the hands of his brother Esau, and he blessed him. And he said, are you indeed my son Esau? And he said, I am. And he said, serve it to me that I may eat of the game of my son, so that my soul will bless you. And he served him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Verse 26.
Okay, so here we go. So
26.
Not
and
only
his
did
father,
offer him 2 kids, he also offered him wine, and he drank wine as well. And Isaac is about to bless him, and he says, wow, you want to read 26, 27? Go ahead. Sure.
26, and his father Isaac said to him, please come closer and kiss me, my son. 27, and he came closer and he kissed him, and he smelled the fragrance of his garments, and he blessed him, and he said, behold, the fragrance of my son is like the fragrance of a field which the Lord has blessed.
Okay, so basically, he gave him 2 major things. He gave him meat through the kid, and he also gave him wine. And these issues are actually what are done on Passover. On Passover, we have 2 different types of meat, and we have a custom of drinking 4 cups of wine at the Passover Seder. And given that Isaac was born on Passover, he's basically blessing his son on his birthday. The logic in doing that is because those who believe in God are basically grateful whenever you have a birthday. We are grateful to God who has given us life. What can be, and you tell me with honesty, what can be a nicer gesture on one's birthday than to go ahead and bless some other one of your own offsprings who is a result of your birth? Because you were born, you were able to contribute and to help Rebecca to actually bring 2 children to the world. So you are grateful to God who gave you life, and in turn, thanks to that gift of life that you were given, you are able to assist God to give life to other people who continue that legacy, continue that tradition. There is no Jewish festival which is more family orientated than Passover. There is a commandment, as a matter of fact, mentioned in Exodus 12 and elsewhere to storytell the Exodus from Egypt to our children, and not only to our children, to our grandchildren as well. Yours truly is a proud grandfather of 7 granddaughters, and they're small still, but it's a pleasure. At least half of them are expected by our meal on Wednesday night a week from now. And part of the responsibility of being able to convey the message and the legacy of the history as it goes, look, as the Israeli prime minister said in 1950, Ben Gurion, the first Israeli prime minister, the difference between the Mayflower and the Pesach Seder is the Mayflower is known by quite a few Americans, but most people outside the United States are not really knowledgeable about the story. It's certainly not about the nitty-gritty details. And you're talking about a story that actually happened only a few hundred years ago altogether. And the Exodus from Egypt, which had happened more than 3,000 years ago, a Jew living anywhere between Hawaii and Australia through Europe and Asia and whatever, has heard the story, and many people that are not, Noachites or others, are quite aware of this marvelous story, and it's still being said everywhere. But the interesting thing is that already in the early part of Genesis, the concept of the unleavened bread was something that they were aware of, and that Isaac was born on that day, and that he goes out and blesses Jacob and Esau eventually as well on that very same day, which is his birthday. So it's not only the birth of the Jewish nation, which occurred on Passover, even our early patriarchs have a very strong link to this story. And incidentally, Lot, who you quoted earlier, actually accommodated Abraham when he went to Egypt the first time. And if I know I'm troubling you a little bit today, but if you want to read back in Genesis 12, you'll see exactly how this happens. Genesis 12, I'll tell you exactly what verse to begin with. Yeah. Genesis 12, verse 9. Start from there.
Verse 9, and Abram traveled continually, traveling southward. 10, and there was a famine in the land, and Abram descended to Egypt to sojourn there because the famine was severe in the land. 11, now it came to pass when he drew near to come to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, behold, now I know that you are a woman of fair appearance. 12, and it will come to pass when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will slay me and let you live. 13, please say that you are my sister in order that it will go well with me because of you, that my soul may live because of you. 14, and it came to pass when Abram came to Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman that she was very pretty. 15, and Pharaoh's princes saw her, and they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to the house of Pharaoh. 16, and he benefited Abraham for her sake, and he had flocks and cattle, and he donkeys, and men servants, and maid servants, and she donkeys and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh with great plagues, as well as his household, on account of Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh summoned Abram, and he said, what is it that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to myself for a wife? And now here is your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh commanded men on his behalf, and they escorted him and his wife and all that was his.
One more verse. One more.
Oh, that's the end of the 13. Chapter on Chabad.org.
13 doesn't bring you straight there. Okay. The next
you want
verse
me to read
says
13:1?
Yeah, that's the first verse there of 13.
13:1 says, and Abram came up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that was his, and Lot with him to the south.
Okay, perfect. So here we see three things. First of all, there was a famine in Canaan, and Abraham goes to Egypt, and he describes Sarah as being his sister, but there's a third person with them throughout the whole story, and that's Lot. Now, if the Egyptians would have made future inquiries, trying to figure out whether indeed Sarah is Abraham's sister or wife, there was somebody else there on the spot who knew the facts per se. And you have to give credit to Lot, who happens to be Abraham's nephew. That's written in chapter 11 of Genesis. Not going into that now, but given his father's name was Haran, which was Abraham's brother. So he was Abraham's nephew. And he easily knew that Sarah is not Abraham's wife, his sister. And if they would have inquired him and figure out who he was, he really endangered his life. So he became close to Abram, as you beautifully said, that when Abraham ascended from Egypt, he was with his wife and everything, and Lot had joined him on the way. So it's not overly surprising that shortly after the angel had blessed Sarah that she will have a baby, that the same evening he came to visit Lot, and Sodom, as you know, was overthrown later on, and Lot and two of his daughters were spared from Sodom. And that was part of a word of thanks to Lot, who covered up for Abraham, who was in Egypt, and could have had his life in danger. It's interesting the way you had the translation of the end of chapter 12. It said that they send him away. That's putting it nicely. In rabbinical literature and also in other parts of Hebrew, Vayishalchu oto, that's in verse 20 of chapter 12, it could mean that he was expelled from Egypt. And just like Abraham was expelled when they discovered that Sarah is his wife and not his sister, the Jews later on, the Hebrews, were sent out of Egypt also and expelled after the plagues as well. So it's fascinating to see that the roots of the Passover story are actually found already in Genesis on three levels. First of all, that Isaac was born on Passover, and a year before his mother and father were told of the forthcoming baby. Secondly, Lot had actually helped Abram when he was in Egypt himself. And when they left Egypt, Abram was full with certain wealth that he received, and Lot was part of that, but he was also credible for not telling that Sarah was Abraham's wife, and he could have easily been in trouble. And then, when Lot has the angels visiting him, he gives them unleavened bread, which could very well be a sign of the future. One way or the other, if Isaac was born on Passover and Rebecca prepares meat, which is exactly like the ones we have on Passover, and Jacob also brings him wine like we drink the cups at the Seder table. So it seems like that legacy is already unfolding at an early stage. And Rebecca, knowing that Jacob is senior or superior to Esau, she is trying to see that the blessing that his father has in mind to give will actually go, first of all, to Jacob. However, and this is something that Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi in Great Britain and died 2 years ago, he pointed out something that we need to bear in mind, and that is when you receive a blessing which is intercepted and not natural, don't expect it to be overly successful. In other words, if in the initial plan Isaac was to bless Esau with a, a materialistic blessing, he probably deserved it, or that would be his way of functioning in the world. So, although Rebecca felt that Jacob needs a material blessing as well, the fact that that division was meant to be was no accident. And eventually, what happened was that the Israelites, for many years, became basically subordinate to Esau and not vice versa. Only much later, the situation had changed. In order for us to be successful in our mission, we have to be honest, we have to be noble. I'm not criticizing Rebecca, but I'm just saying that the blessing that was received in somewhat of a deceiving way didn't actually serve the purpose in the long run. Each one of the two brothers, Jacob and Esau, had a different role to play, and they both have place. And the fact that Isaac loved Esau was not a negative thing, because he also saw a future there as well. I think my feel about our study in general is that although, as it says in Isaiah, the word of the Torah comes from Zion and Jerusalem, but it is also a universal message, which is being conveyed to the world at large. And therefore, our eyes should be opened to other people and trying to see how they, in their beautiful ways, can also contribute to the divine message. And therefore, both Isaac and Rebekah, each one in his own way, contributes also to the universal message of God. And to a large extent, Passover is, although a very national festival of the merging of the Jewish nation, but that's part of our overall role in trying to bring the message to all peoples of the world. Let's not forget that 7 weeks after Passover was the revelation. And the revelation initially was offered to all peoples. And certainly the Ten Commandments are things which are shared by the world as at large. I want to open the floor to you. I've spoken quite a bit tonight, but I wanted to be an eye opener on a certain thing which I don't think you did before. And you are more than welcome to ask your questions. Please.
Yeah, Rabbi, I've got one question on YouTube from Cookie about the blessing to Jacob. Hold on one second. Sorry, got lots going on there. Wondering, did Jacob? Would you call it a theft of the blessing, or is it still a legit blessing?
As I in various classes have taught in the past, one thing is for sure that if he would not deserve the blessing, he wouldn't get it because you can fool Isaac maybe whose eyes are dimmed, but you can't fool God. And the blessing that Isaac gave is a blessing that comes from God. Consequently, if it was not well deserved, it certainly would not happen. That's something which is totally obvious. There's no doubt in my mind or in anybody in serious thinking of biblical thought that Jacob deserved the blessing that Rebekah had achieved for him. That's not the issue. The issue is to receive a blessing in a way that is disrespectful to your father and that he is unaware of what's happening exactly. And to a certain extent, also between wife and husband, it wasn't a very simple arrangement that's happening over here. This is the question in mind. If he didn't deserve it, God wouldn't give it to him. But even when you deserve a blessing, there's a certain way that a certain ethic of proper human dynamics and respect that would be a better way of achieving the same purpose. Even good things that happen, we should always try to do them in a way that we don't insult somebody on the way while doing it. Sure. Anybody else? With great pleasure. I know you've heard a lot of sessions today, but you are more than welcome to agree or disagree with what we've been speaking about or ask.
So to be clear, Rabbi, you're saying that the bedrock of the Passover goes back to the time of Isaac. Is that what you're saying? Maybe even sooner than that.
Absolutely. Not only that, one of the things that comes up is that the in Genesis 15 it says that the Jews will be in servitude for 400 years. And actually, without going into full calculation, now 400 years originate from the day Isaac was born, because the actual period that they were in Egypt was slightly more than half that amount, not 400, only 210 years. But as we learned today, just very briefly, Isaac was 60 years old. You read that yourself when Jacob and Esau were born. And when Jacob reaches Egypt, when Joseph is the viceroy, he has an encounter with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asks him in Arabic, Adesh Umrak, or in English, how old are you? And Jacob says that he's 130. So if Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born, and Jacob is 130 years of age when he meets Pharaoh, 190 years actually came from the time Isaac was born until the servitude began when the entire Jacob family was now in Egypt. So that's even part of the actual calculation of how we work out the period being in Egypt. But what's so nice about it is that you see the roots of the merging of the nation very clearly from the patriarchs, the way the Passover legacy was emerged.
Rabbi Lara's asking a question. She says the only question
Sure.
that comes up a lot in her community is what we have to do as Noahites to be prepared for Pesach, even if we donate to some charities. What would be the proper way of donating it, or should we say in honor of Pesach?
Um, Listen, charities are always a credible act. The truth is that for a classical family trying to keep the Passover a 7 day celebration, especially the early part, it's one of the relatively expensive festivals. And that's why there are a lot of charities that relate to helping people celebrate. But I think the dimension involved there is another nice thing about it because the actual matzah or the unleavened bread, as it is called in the Bible in Deuteronomy 16 poor bread. Basically, we don't give it enough time to rise, and it somewhat, to a certain extent, symbolizes that we were in servitude and relative poverty when the issue began. So symbolically, when we relate to other people who are underprivileged, there's something very nice about it. When I worked for a couple of years in South Africa in the 90s, and I was there when you had what they call the reconciliation between the Africans and the Europeans or the whites living in the country. And that was quite interesting when Mandela came into power, etc. The sad thing was that when Mandela took over, some of his government were less sensitive to their own Africans than when the whites were running the country. Sometimes when a person lived in an underprivileged way and all of a sudden it becomes well-to-do, he doesn't respect other mates of his that haven't got up further. And I was taken aback by this because when all of a sudden you are successful, you are running the country, you should at least try to upgrade all the people that were suffering for many years under a government which had not related to them enough in decency. Now you are running the country yourself. So be nice to other people in this opportunity. When the Jewish people receive freedom, the first thing we have to do is to try to be considerate towards those who haven't got that far yet. I don't know if that answers you, but that's certainly I deeply feel that way.
Bart or Hans, you guys have any questions?
No, I must process.
Same here.
Yeah. We're pretty quiet on Facebook today, but YouTube, Rabbi, we got a person with a dilemma. Let me just. This person's been asked to teach drawing to children, but the theme is on the Knights of the Round Table, and the person's asking, is it a sin to have that theme because it's a fabrication by people who were wrong, meaning it's got Christian tones, but there's a bit of a chit chat around, focusing on the ethics. I know it's a little off topic, but any words of advice for the person inquiring?
Listen, if it's just a means of how to convey a message, and because they come from a Christian background, they're using a method which is more convenient for the people hearing, I don't see that to be a problem as such, as long as it's clear what the goal is. In other words, it's often common that people, when they try to convey a message to others, they use the tactics that they are familiar with from the past. But of course, it's got to be clear that it's merely a means to try to hand over a message, knowing that that's not the authentic way, but it's a way of making it clear to people that don't know otherwise. Yeah, that is true. We, over 40 years ago, my parents of blessed memory, invited two students who were learning in this country to join our meal on Passover, and instead they brought us a Norwegian bishop and his wife, and it was quite an interesting experience, I admit. The whole Passover, I actually ran the story there, and it was a little bit challenging because we were having wine, and there's a little bit of a challenge how to deal that with Gentiles, but it actually was a very nice evening, and I did not try in any way to how would I put it, to censor anything that's there. But truthfully, in the course of Jewish history, because there were many blood libels associated with Passover, either that they prepare the wine or the unleavened bread with blood or whatever, it wasn't something that I could totally ignore during the course of that evening, because it was something that, especially in medieval history, happened so many times. To the extent that in America, where I was born, we didn't use red wine on Passover for years because there was something red which related to blood that Jews were apprehensive of using that in the diaspora. It's true.
Rabbi Kimberly in the class is asking, she says, although the blessing that Isaac received worked out, did Rebekah's action of deceit receive any reprimand?
Yes, definitely. We suffered as a result a lot from Esau later on, to the extent I didn't want to hassle you that much. At the end of that chapter 27, Rebekah calls her son Jacob and says, listen to me again, and please go to my brother Laban, who is your uncle, and I will call back for you when Esau will calm down. At the moment, Esau is plotting to kill you. That's what Rebekah said. Isaac actually says to Jacob to go to Laban for a different reason altogether. There are two girls there, and at least one of them I want you to marry. And Jacob was pretty good at that. He married both. But it's two different approaches. Rebekah was concerned about Jacob's well-being, and Isaac was not scared that Esau would do anything to Jacob as long as Isaac was living. But he wanted to see Jacob start his future and build up a Jewish family, which he did.
We had a question before that by Uwana. Said, blessings, Rabbi, for a beautiful and remarkable teaching. I note that prior to issuing the blessing, Isaac required his son to prepare for him a favored meal. Is this requirement patterned in the relationship between man and Hashem? He says, I ask the holy days are associated. He asks if the holy days are associated with the offerings.
I very much like the question. I do think that on Sabbath and festivals, part of the higher quality meal that we have, or in the time that there was a temple when there were offerings there as well, is a means of expressing a word of thanks to what God has given us. But I genuinely mentioned this evening about Isaac's birthday because I feel that every time that I have a birthday, I feel that I owe respect to my parents. They brought me into this world, although they're not living anymore. But thanks to Mom and Dad, this is the reason I'm able to give you this lecture. And how can anybody ever, literally, compensate them, if you would use that expression, or reciprocate for such a wonderful favor that I owe them? And needless to say that God is the source of all of this, so even more so. But I mean, if it's easier to explain religious terms, I feel, through human dynamics, and my feeling of gratitude to my parents of bringing me is something that I feel every year when I have a birthday. And here, Isaac is using his birthday also as a word of thanks to God, but also trying to bring forward that tradition for the next generation. And every year on Passover, to a certain extent, the birthday of our nation, we are trying to convey a similar message.
Oh, beautiful. Rabbi Claire on YouTube she's inquiring, aren't you supposed to demand that your Gentile guests on Passover that they be circumcised?
Only if you eat the Paschal lamb. We don't have that yet. If you look in Exodus 12 at the end of the chapter, around verse 40, it specifically ran about the Paschal lamb. You don't have a Paschal lamb today. And eating the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs are not restricted. But that's a very interesting insight that was mentioned. That's true. If we have the Paschal lamb, that's true. Not yet. Matter of fact, very common in Israel that the ambassadors invite especially the ambassadors from overseas are invited to Jewish families to share with them Passover in the country and give a little bit of our history on the special date.
My friend Barbara's asking, how did Esau know how to cook?
Why do you assume that he was not an intelligent individual? He was a little bit of a hunter and wild, but he probably was had very good hands. I would guess, by the way, that he was probably a better cook than his brother. He was a man of the world, very much so, and to that extent, quite independent. There is a
Rebecca
debate.
must have taught him to cook a little bit, I'm sure.
I imagine so. And it never says that Rebecca disliked him. She just felt more towards Jacob, but she didn't disregard him as her son. Not at all. And I think, by the way, Esau had respect of her. He was a bit scared of her, but he had respect to her as well. She was a very determined person. She knew what she wanted. And don't forget, when Isaac's eyes were dim, she was dominating the house even more than before.
Has anybody else got any questions for the rabbi before we wind down? I mean,
what about the stew that Isaac made that caused Esau to give up his rights? That's a part of a longer discussion about how you get the firstborn rights, what exactly was done on that behalf. But if you read the last verse of Genesis 25, you will find that Jacob didn't only prepare a stew. He gave him a whole list of things. And what he basically was trying to buy was the firstborn rights, which in tradition were those who were meant to actually work in the sanctuary. Realistically, because of the golden calf sin, which we spoke about actually 2 weeks ago, the firstborn were commit that sin as well, and therefore the service in the temple was transferred to the Levites. And this weekend, yesterday, we started to read the book of Leviticus, and the Levites were those who did not sin. But initially, the idea was for the firstborn to receive that activity, and that's what Jacob was interested in. And Esau didn't actually see much of a purpose in that. As you can read there in the end of Genesis 25, it's mentioned. I'm very grateful to you, and I hope you had a good time, and would like to wish you all a wonderful week ahead of you.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. So we're going to wind that down. Hashem willing, we'll be back next week with Rabbi Goldberg. We'll keep you guys posted with that, but I want to thank Rabbi Herschler for joining with us today and sharing profound wisdom. It means a lot to us. So on that note, it's a couple minutes early, but, let's sign out for today. We'll see you more next week with our Genesis class, Hashem willing. So bye for now.